No one chooses the arena. No one wakes up and decides today is the day. But when the moment came, and for thousands of them it came, something unexpected happened. They didn't run, they didn't beg, they didn't deny. They walked in. Historians noticed it. Roman officials wrote about it. Even those who despised the movement couldn't fully explain it. Here were ordinary people, fishermen, merchants, slaves, mothers, facing execution with something that looked, from the outside, almost like peace. Not the peace of someone who had given up. The peace of someone who knew something. To understand why, you have to understand what they believed about death. Not in theory. Not as doctrine recited in a room. In the marrow. In the place where belief becomes action. The ancient world feared death the way you'd expect. Greeks called the afterlife a gray, shadowless place. Even heroes wandered there without purpose. Romans built monuments to outlast it. Letting emperors carved their names in stone, hoping something of them would survive the silence. Fame was the closest thing to immortality anyone could count on. You won battles, you fed the poor, you built something large enough that people would say your name after you were gone. That was the best hope on offer. It wasn't nothing. But it wasn't enough to make a man walk calmly into fire, and even that faded. Death was the end. Everyone knew it. You built what you could, you held what you could, and eventually it was taken. And then, a tomb outside Jerusalem, empty. The first Christians didn't inherit their faith from a book. Not primarily. They inherited it from people, from men and women who had seen something, who had touched something, who had eaten with someone they had watched die 3 days before. Paul wrote it plainly. He appeared to Peter, then to the 12, then to more than 500 people at once, most of whom, Paul notes, are still alive. Go ask them. That's not theology. That's testimony. And testimony changes the way you face death. Because if Jesus rose, really rose, bodily, actually, then death was not the end. It was not a wall, it was a door. Terrifying, perhaps. Narrow, but a door, and doors open. There's a word Paul used that the early Christians took seriously. Died. You have died. Past tense. Already. He meant it. Your old self, the one that feared, grasped, and clawed for survival, was gone. Buried with Christ in baptism. A new life had begun in its place. One that death had no claim on. Because the self that death threatened, the fearful, grasping, mortal self, no longer existed. This wasn't poetry. It was the operating principle of their lives, and it changed everything about how they faced what was coming. If you have already died, you have nothing left to lose. The executioner cannot threaten someone who no longer fears the blade. Not because they were numb, not because they didn't feel pain, but because the thing Rome used as its ultimate weapon, death itself, had already been stripped of its power. In their minds, in their bones, emperors could take their lives. They could not take what came after. They believed in resurrection, not survival, not the soul drifting upward into comfortable mist, not some vague continuation of consciousness. Resurrection, bodily, physical, real. They believed the same power that pulled Jesus out of the grave would one day pull them out too. That the body buried in shame would be raised in glory. That what was lost would be restored. Not metaphor. Event. Something that would happen. Something worth waiting for. Peter wrote that this hope was a living one. Not wishful thinking, not comforting fiction. A hope that moved, that held, that could carry the weight of a life. This is why Paul could write from a prison cell, chains on his wrists. Execution likely, and speak of joy. not forced joy, not performance, the kind that comes from knowing how the story ends. To live is Christ, to die is gain. Not resignation, arithmetic. If this life, even in chains, was filled with something worth living for, then what waited beyond death was simply more of it, more of the best thing they had ever known. Why fear more? Ignatius of Antioch was taken to Rome to be executed around 108 AD. He wrote letters along the way, cheerful ones. He begged the churches not to intervene, not to appeal on his behalf, not to use their influence to spare him. Let me be ground by the teeth of lions. Let me be found purebred. He wasn't performing courage. He wasn't indifferent to pain. He was longing to finish the journey, to be with Christ, to finally arrive at the thing he had been moving toward his whole life. The arena wasn't a tragedy to him. It was a threshold. Polycarp was 86 years old when soldiers came for him. They offered him a way out. Curse Christ, just once, just words, and he could go home. He refused. 86 years I have served him. He has never done me wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? They burned him. He prayed as the flames rose. Thanked God for counting him worthy. Worthy. That was the word he used. This is what Rome could never understand, could never break. You cannot terrorize people who have already made peace with dying. You cannot silence a movement whose members consider death a doorway. You cannot use the grave as a threat against those who believe it has already been opened. The empire tried. For 300 years, it tried. And in the end, it was the empire that fell, not the faith. We live in a world still afraid of death, still building monuments, still carving names in stone, still filling the silence with noise, with motion, with anything that keeps the thought at bay. The fear hasn't changed. We have simply found more sophisticated ways to avoid looking at it, more comfortable ways to pretend it isn't coming. Only the monuments have. The first Christians weren't braver than us. They weren't made of different material. They felt fear, they felt pain, they grieved, they wept at graves just as we do. Stephen, the first martyr, saw a vision as the stones fell. He didn't close his eyes. He looked up, but they were convinced of something, deeply, quietly, unshakably, that the grave had already been broken from the inside, that death had met something it could not hold, that the story, their story, did not end in the ground, that everything they had suffered, the beatings, the exile, the loneliness, the loss was not waste. It was passage. And if that was true, if it was really, actually, historically true, then the lions were not the end of the story. The fire was not the end. The cross was not the end. It was the beginning of what came next. Just a door, already open, waiting, on the other side of fear,